We now have the Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahman. Manu Pillai talks about the hidden mosaic of characters behind emperors and invaders. He shall be in conversation with Avik Chanda. Manu Pillai is the author of The Ivory Throne, Rebel Sultans, and most recently, The Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahman. Formerly Chief of Staff to Dr. Shashi Tharoor, he has in the past worked at the House of Lords in Britain and with the BBC on their Incarnation History series. Pillai's first book, The Ivory Throne, won the 2017 Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar. His other writings have appeared in The Hindu, Open Magazine, The Times of India, Hindustan Times, The New Statesman, Mint Lounge, and other publications. Avik Chanda is an author, business advisor, entrepreneur, trainer, and speaker. Chanda has published 2 poetry collections, Jokhun Bideshe and Footnotes, and a novel, Anchor. His acclaimed business book, From Command to Empathy, Using EQ in the Age of Disruption, co-authored with Shumon Ghosh, was featured in the 2018 Amazon's Best Reads under Business Strategy and Management. His latest book, Dara Shuko, is a non-fictional account of Shah Jahan's favorite son. Let us welcome both our panelists onto the stage with a huge round of applause.
Today, that signage has made a habit of about toppling over like half a dozen times. And particularly for people whose main challenge is hair cover, that's why you're there and I'm here.
Clever, clever.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session. We have a lot of interesting, more than narratives, characters in store for you. But before we delve into that, let's start off with a few really important and fundamental questions. There's this huge resurgence of interest in history. History writing, historical fiction, non-fiction, movies as well. We've had Manikarnika and we have Takht coming up sometime later this year. Why do you think that's the case?
In many ways, I think we're still a country that's trying to figure out what our identity is, what our self-image is. We've still not gotten over basic debates of whether this is a pluralistic society or whether it's a one religion, sort of majoritarian paradise. There are all these debates that are still happening, and now with I think the speed of the internet, the swiftness of communication, and the fact that you have a very young population that hasn't necessarily been exposed to history in the most engaging or interesting fashion, means that suddenly there's a discussion around it. Even politicians, we look at the last elections. One party says, 70 years, the other party didn't do anything. The other party will say, 70 years before that, we were the ones who got independence for the country. Everybody's drawing on history. History becomes the source of raw material to justify various ideologies, to build up various narratives. You pick and choose, of course, that's how they do it. But the political relevance of history being what it is, discussion being so alive and so electric, naturally there's going to be a lot of talk around history. And I think, it's a good thing for writers like you and me, because suddenly we've got a captive audience, as it were. And if you do a fairly good job of writing and doing your research properly, then you've got an audience that's willing to engage, that's willing to listen, and not necessarily just, take what they've received on the internet or wherever, receive wisdom for granted and believe that this is the truth. And the idea that there isn't one truth, there are multiple variants to it depending on the context and period and so on. I think people are growing more alive to that, to understanding that in a big diverse country like ours, you can't have a monochromatic version of history, you can't have a black and white version of history, you can't have one single narrative of history. It's going to be layered and complex and therefore very interesting.
Great. So your latest book is refreshing and is new in very many ways. The first thing that struck me when I was reading it is, unlike the huge academic tomes of historians that we are used to, where every 2 paragraphs are peppered with a whole list of superscripts, and then you have like half a page of footnotes. What is extremely refreshing, and therefore what makes it very accessible, is that each of these individual essays just flows almost, I'm tempted to use the word story, except that it's historic, and it's completely sort of research-based and authentic, but it flows as easily and as lucidly as a story. And at the end, you've got your endnotes and you've got sort of bibliographical references for each of the individual chapters under the respective parts. So what made you make that? Because I think that marks an important change in the narrative style of writing history.
It was, I think, an interesting challenge for me because my first book is a 700-page book with 104 pages of notes. And I've done these heavily footnoted books, so it was this was an interesting constructive challenge to have, because in the first book, for example, I had all the space I needed. I could do a 20,000 word chapter built around one idea, one focus, or one particular topic, whereas here the challenge was how do you encapsulate an entire story, the larger ideas that are pinned to that story in 1,000 words. It's not easy when you've got to try and nuance it, you try to polish it, present the argument in a compelling fashion, and write in an attractive fashion. So doing from a 20,000 word chapter to doing individual essays that are about 1,000 to 2,000 words was an interesting proposition in general. But I thought the idea was also this. My first two books, were longish. They were heavily footnoted and so on, written in an engaging fashion regardless. But everywhere I went, events like this, a lot of young kids would come, college kids would come saying that they all enjoyed the event. They all enjoyed listening to the storytelling, etc. But they were always intimidated by big, heavy history books, because for them, history is this dull, dry, do it to death kind of a subject. And then that's what got me thinking, the idea with the third book is to pepper it with these 61 essays on a diversity of topics, which you can dip in, dip out wherever you want. You can read them without getting overwhelmed. And this is meant as an introduction to history, as an introduction to India's riches of the past, because instead of one long narrative around the Deccan in my second book, or around princely Travancore in my first book, this is a diversity. This is essentially like a buffet, which, when I was doing it, a number of my PhD colleagues in London said, no, how can you do this? This is, extremely risky. You'll damage your reputation by doing it. But I said, look, I've earned my academic stripes with the first two books. I've earned my peer review and my, the Sahitya Academy Award that she mentioned, which is why I think at this time there is need for somebody to bridge the world of academia with a lay audience, because there is appetite, there is interest. We can't merely stick to the seminar circuit or small groups and not do the business of communicating history to a larger audience. You can't not communicate and then complain that other people are twisting it and perverting it and putting out untruths. You've got to make the effort. So I think this is the essays book. The third one is entirely tailored for people who are hesitant about history, and to convince them to start taking an interest in history, telling them that just dip in where you want, you'll develop an appetite, and maybe next time when you see that big history tome, you'll give that a chance.
And I think very many disciplines which have been very sort of, stiff and academic traditionally, history being one, economics is the other, and very recently, Abhijit Vinayak Banerjee has been quoted famously as saying, during the time when he and Nestor Duflo were doing poor economics, every academic peer or colleague said, do not write a popular book on economics. You do that, and your credentials as an economist of high repute, you're done. And it was proved completely
to be otherwise. It's so interesting, right? Like around the world, the whole culture now, the whole tendency now is to smash gatekeepers. Gatekeeping is no longer what it used to be. The world is changing. Information is becoming more democratic. There was a time when you had to go and sit in the archives and wait 4 hours to get a file. Now increasingly stuff is being digitized. The world is changing, and you have to change with the world. That's a natural phenomenon. And old gatekeepers of older establishments who feel that this is not the way to go about it, and there's a puritanistic sort of position with history, I think that it's pointless if you're looking at the larger picture. I think when things are changing, you need to be on top of it, because otherwise another party is going to come and take over that. So you better, get your game and get your act together.
So I'm sure most of the members of the audience are, those of you who haven't read his book as yet, are dying to get into some of the really interesting character studies and stories and episodes that he's chronicled across these 60+ essays. And let's start off maybe with a person who's got a very distinct Kolkata connection. Nawab Wajid Ali Shah of Awadh. As we all know, in 1856, when he was forced to abdicate by the British, he was then exiled, but he had a massive pension, and then he had a project which Manu will take us through, of trying to create like a miniature Awadh or a miniature Lucknow. So tell us about that project and its
It's
outcome.
not surprising. You see, this man was such a colorful prince. And, people usually show him as this completely, sort of luxuriating away in his palace and whiling his time away, not good for anything. But the fact is, he was far more interesting than that. He's the one, I think, who invented that interesting kind of kurta, right, where you have one exposed nipple. And this, I know, traveled even to Jaipur. And there's this lovely painting that in the colonial times, I think one of these colonial restorers was very scandalized by this exposed nipple. So they painted over that nipple and made it look like brown textile rather than brown fabric rather than skin. So this man's, he's got an interesting view on art, he's got music, he's the one who dances around at Holi and things like that. And naturally, he's also ruling Awadh at the time when the British are becoming increasingly confident of their power here. Which means suddenly they're like civilizing mission, what are these barbaric customs, you should not dance around like this, you're a king, you're supposed to have your back straight and sort of sit on a throne with great dignity and so on. The idea of how power was negotiated in India, which was very much in contact with the people, that did not make sense to them. For them, there was this hierarchicalized sort of system where you had to be on top looking a certain way. So Wajid Ali Shah obviously didn't fit that. Now he gets his grand pension, comes off to Calcutta as an exile, while interestingly his mother sails all the way to London to go and directly talk to Queen Victoria, mother to mother, as she thought, and persuade her to return the kingdom. Only when she got there did she realize that Victoria didn't have that power, and all they could talk about was fabric and architecture and things like that, because they weren't allowed to talk about these things. And the poor lady on the way back, she dies in Paris, which is where she's still buried. Wajid Ali Shah, of course, lives for many more decades, and you can see at the beginning there's this miniature kingdom he creates because he's got this huge estate. When he's come from Awadh, there's a huge retinue that follows him, lots of retainers, lots of servants and followers. And he's built houses for everybody. He's got heaps of wives to begin with. At one point, the British are scandalized because in a single day, he divorced 24 wives. And they said, you can't shed begums, one fine morning like that. And he replies saying, but they're old and ugly. Not my words, that's what he said. And they said, that's not the government's responsibility. Who's going to take care of these women? These are all wives of yours. And he says the government should take care of these women because he didn't know, his worldview was like that. And then, of course, his chief Begum herself had to leave and she had to start living in adultery with somebody else, which was basically, she couldn't tolerate this man anymore. He wouldn't really give his kids much money. The pensions given to the princelings was all petty, whereas he kept most of the money. So increasingly seems to have become this slightly, I wouldn't use the word bitter, but a slightly frustrated sort of man who knows what he once was, and now all he has is this toy kingdom where he's got one section like a zoo with lots of interesting wild animals. He's got all these begums sequestered in another place. He's got prostitutes and people. There's an entire camp that lives with him. It's tragic in a way that, this is how it went down for him. And of course, his greatest defiance of the empire was that they thought he would die very quickly. But instead, he lived till the grand old age of 80-something, I think, and kept milking them for that pension, which they promised him. And, finally, he went off in a blaze of glory, really, in comparative terms. But then, of course, the camp splits and the story comes to an end. It's both tragedy as well as comedy as well as human quirk, because this was not your standard Indian prince. This was a very colorful, interesting man.
Talking about going down in history, literally in a blaze of glory, particularly around the time of Wajid Ali Shah, there's probably no character more defiant, more heroic, more colorful than Rani Lakshmibai, Manikarnika, the Rani of Jhansi, right? And popular perception for like ever, okay, so in my living memory, all the way from Amar Chitta Katha to the movie Manikarnika, which was released last year, all of them paint one single narrative, that she had these sensibilities to begin with, and those were honed as she saw the continued and increasing amount of oppression that was being handed, and then things came to a crux when the mutiny broke out, and there was not just a question of no option, she willingly, deliberately, heroically, defiantly went and did what she did, joined the rebels under the flag of Bahadur Shah Zafar, and the rest is history. However, in your short but very pointed essay on Manikarnika, you've shot a couple of holes into that myth, haven't you?
Her personality was what the myth makes it out to be, which is that she was a very proactive woman. She did ride, she did have a military sort of bent to her. She was very well educated and trained. When she was a kid, her friends were these boys, the Peshwa, the last Peshwa's adopted son and people like that, who were also rebels in 1857 with her. So she grew up with this very interesting crowd of kids. But because of the accident of gender, really, because she was born a girl, she had to marry and go off somewhere else. There again, you find that she's, more or less her own person. She's not a conventional princess who is happy spending all her time in the Zenana. But what's interesting about the rebellion phase is that far from the rebellion breaking out and Rani Lakshmibai immediately joining it, she spent a year negotiating with the British. She took the fort, held it for the British government in her own words, I think, and she says that, look, I'm holding this for you in the expectation that in response or in return, they would actually return the kingdom to her and give her back what they had snatched from her. So she spent a year not joining the rebellion, in fact, positively lambasting the rebels, saying that, these guys are the worst kind of people I've met, etc. Partly because that was her audience. She was communicating to the British. She had these wonderful, Western-trained lawyers coming in and, bargaining for her and negotiating for her. She understood law. In this monochromatic view of Lakshmibai as this woman who dies at the end of a sword in a battle, you lose the idea that she was also a woman of great intelligence, and she was capable of arguing like that in a very legal fashion, in very legal language with the British. And then when nothing works, when the British say nothing doing, you're not actually going to ever get Jhansi back, that's when she joins the rebels. So it isn't the case that she was sort of, bursting with energy and sort of looking to sort of join the rebellion as soon as she could. The fact of the matter is, she was open to both possibilities. When one didn't work out, that's when she joined the other. And there's a very there's a good paper trail for this. All the evidence suggests that this is the case. There's letters she wrote to the British that we're talking about. So the mythology that we have now, once she joined the rebellion and then died, does tend to sort of gloss over some of these inconvenient details. But that's true of most Indian historical figures. We tend to look at them in one way, not the other. Even, forget battles and queens, even someone like Mirabai, the great Bhakti saint, we focus on her Bhakti, we focus on her love for Krishna, we focus on her devotional songs, but we don't really focus much on her descent. The idea that this was a woman who, when her husband died and her husband's family said, you must become a sati, she said, I will not become a sati. They said, you must live like a widow. She said, I will not live like a widow. They said, you can't speak to any other men. She said, I'll go out and meet all these creative men and the saints and the traveling singers, etc. She wanted to meet. And finally, she walks out of that Rajput palace and becomes a wandering saint herself. That is the height of defiance. She's defying not only a patriarchal order, but she's defying all of Rajput conventions at the time. But we don't really focus on that. Instead, we've tamed her into a Krishna Bhakta, turned her into this bhajan singing lady, which she was also. But you focus on that at the cost of the other. And as I said, we do this to most of our historical figures. Pick and choose and decide that which one fits our current moralities and current sensibilities better.
So maybe a very brief excursion from Mirabai to one of the most defining figures of the 20th century, Mahatma Gandhi. I think one of the many things that I found extremely refreshing in your book is traditionally historians have not just shied away from, they have shunned any kind of the hint or let alone a discourse on a what if question. And I think possibly again this is a sign of the changing times and a sign of maybe engaging with a larger audience with questions which are there in the public sphere. It's not as if the what if will go away if we answer it one way or the other, but I think it's important to negotiate that to begin with. And you have this very interesting essay which takes off from the fact that Gandhiji had once remarked that given a chance, ideally, he would have liked to live to the ripe old age of 125 years. Now that would have taken us to 1994. So what if the Mahatma had lived to be 125?
It was a very naughty essay, and I know it has divided lots of opinions doing these what if essays. But the idea of what if isn't to create a new mythology or a new, sort of grand picture of the what if is a way to also inquire. We think, for example, a lot of ultra right-wingers think that if the Muslim invasions hadn't happened, we'd have been living in some magnificent Hindu paradise. Not really the case. The idea of a what if is also to suggest that what you think would have happened is not how it would have happened, because parameters were different. What you think was some sort of paradise was not a paradise, because you look at the standards of the time. So the Gandhiji essay partly happened because, I was interested that this man wanted to live till the age of 125. Like you said, he would have died just after Babri Masjid happened. The idea of the essay was two things. One, to see how we would have treated Gandhi, and the other to see how Gandhi would have responded to various events in post-independence India or post-colonial India. So how would we have treated Gandhi? Already by the time of independence, he was becoming irrelevant in terms of the actual policies of the Congress party. Because of the simple fact that now power was at hand. Now it was about, framing the law, forming the institutions, taking charge. The Congress was already in power from 1937 onwards in 8 provinces under the 1935 Constitution of India. They had already tasted power. If you look at the records of the late 1930s, there's already talk of corruption, nepotism, senior Congress leaders giving giving positions to their chelas as opposed to actual loyal party workers. All these issues that come naturally with power had already started afflicting the Congress party by the late 30s. So Gandhiji's philosophizing was suddenly no longer, let's say, at the head of the table. Everyone was interested now in looking to the future, whether it was ideologically, the big dams and the industries, etc., and not Gandhiji's, village, self-sufficient villages. So even when he dies, what does the Congress party do? And it's not a complaint. It's just interesting to note that his ashes were scattered in different parts of the country, and there were these special trains that took the ashes to different parts of the country. Along with the flag of the Indian Union, there was also the Congress flag on each of these trains, because his death in a way legitimized what was happening. It legitimized that transition from Raj to a party while keeping the rest of the framework more or less the same. And it's funny to think that they had some 4,000, 5,000 soldiers leading Gandhiji's body to the cremation ghat, when Gandhiji wanted nothing but to die like a monk. He didn't want to die like an emperor with, soldiers and holding guns and sort of giving him these salutes. That was not the death he wanted. So even in death, very quickly, the Mahatma became, this emperor-like figure. Now, in the years that followed, look at would Gandhi have become an international problem for Jawaharlal Nehru and Jinnah, because Gandhi at one point had threatened to go and live in Pakistan. So how would Jinnah and Nehru have handled that? How would he have dealt with the 1962 Chinese incursion? Would he have decided, I'm going to go and stand at the border, and then made that another issue, or would he have come back? During the emergency, how would Indira Gandhi have responded to a Gandhiji? If he had said, I'm going to go on a fast unto death, would she have said, fine, go ahead? Just a few quibbles that way to see how the people in power in India would have responded to a Gandhi post-independence. Once the British are gone, how are you going to live with this man who's above all sort of control, above everything else, and therefore has his own interesting power? He could easily, for instance, have rejected the constitution. If he had, what kind of a crisis would he have gone through? Because Gandhiji wasn't particularly happy with this whole project of a constitution inspired by lots of Western ideals. So you have issues like that. The other is also about looking at, the way we treat leaders, the way we look at, various historical figures. Historical figures always have a certain utility. And you see this in 2011 when the Anna Hazare thing happened. Everyone said Messiah, the new Gandhi, this and that. We're in 2020, and where has that gone? Where has that man gone? Because society moves on very quickly. A national trait we have, and all societies have, is basic hypocrisy, because that's just how it is. Everybody survives till they serve a purpose, after which things overtake them. So placing Gandhi in that context, this man we enshrine and idealize so much, to see whether this hypocrisy would have applied even to our treatment of him, to see how he would have responded to all these events, that was the idea of this what if essay. It was, as I said, very naughty and, seems to have divided opinion, but I thought it was worth investigating it, not to actually do a what if, but to hold a mirror to ourselves and to say that, who are we really, in terms of, we nicely enshrine him and completely cordially ignore everything he said, because it wasn't much of it was not practical, much of it was perhaps ethically even questionable, but we still enshrine that and pretend that on the one hand we put him on a pedestal, and then we're looking at other things and following other ideas and principles. So it was just a way to hold up that mirror.
Again, if you take one of the key milestones just before 1994, right? So 1991, liberalization. Ambedkar, for one, would have been its strongest champion, right? And would that, again, because we are on this what if tour, not have pushed Gandhiji into greater sort of insignificance in the overall scheme of things?
Yeah, I mean, he was already having these feuds with Mokshagundam Visvesvaraya, the great Mysorean engineer / Divan of Mysore. That gentleman was somebody who said that your idea is not to mollycoddle Indian industry. You're not supposed to protect them. It's supposed to give them wings to fly. So regulate with that in mind. And this was a debate they're having in the 30s. And Mokshagundam says that, I have no issues with Gandhi's idea of villages being, sufficient and having access to things, etc. But they cannot come at the cost of industrialization. The engines of the future are industrialization. So they have this big like exchange in the press and through letters, etc., and they agree to disagree. So it's, yeah, it is very likely that Gandhiji would not have liked liberalization one bit. And and speaking of irrelevance though, given his views on many things, the political class would have made him irrelevant long before that. Yeah.
Another what-if story, and this is something that we just can't resist. It came up briefly during your conversation with Sudip Chakraborty and Shashi Tharoor yesterday. What if the British Raj had not taken over India? And I do this for the benefit of many members of the audience who may not have attended yesterday's session. So why don't you just sort of take us through
that was again that what if was basically to create a mental picture of the kind of India that existed, you know, at the cusp when the British are sort of about to take over. To begin with, you know, people often think we've been speaking all our wonderful Indian languages and that one of our Indian languages would have been a so-called national language in future. Not really, because for the last nearly 1,000 years, before English became the official language, Persian was the language of diplomacy. And I said this yesterday also, I was startled when I was doing my research on my first book to find a letter from about 1818 where the Maharani of Travancore, a Malayali queen, is writing to the English governor in Madras, but they're both writing to each other in Persian, because as far as Kerala, Persian had become recognized as the international language of diplomacy, because it connected everything from Iran and Turkey really, all the way till even parts of Thailand, you know, if you look at the earlier period. So we'd have been surprised that it's actually Persian that would have been, you and I would have been having this conversation probably in Persian. The other thing is also, the north and the south might have evolved in slightly different ways. The south being a peninsula might have come under French influence, because Tipu Sultan was a friend of the French. He was almost, you know, quite successful in importing lots of technology from the French and from Europe. Would Enlightenment ideas, would Western rationalism, etc. have come to India via the French and through Mysore, because that king was interested in it. He was interested in military technology. At one point, he also talks about sending one of his sons to study in France because he wants his sons to go off to Paris and get an education there. So would the South have evolved in some sort of French-influenced domain, and would the North, how would the North have evolved? The strongest force in the North politically were the Marathas. And they sort of had an advantage in keeping the Mughal emperor going. So as Shashi Tharoor summed it up yesterday, we might have ended up with a token Mughal emperor in power, a system dominated by the Marathas really, but that didn't really make them very popular in many parts of the country. So it would still have been a slightly awkward, potentially authoritarian, you know, totalitarian sort of system. So putting that in context was the idea with that what if, to say that, you know, there would not have been this unitary map as when we think of India, we get this picture of the map, but that map would not have existed to begin with. The country might have been broken up into several pieces, several large pieces, each dominated by one set or one group of people, and speaking and working in a system that was still very much Persianate and Islamicate, because that's how the world was at that time.
I'm really tempted to go through all of the 61 essays, but A, is the paucity of time, and B, those would be spoilers, because many of these read as, and I mean it in a very complimentary, not derogatory sense, they read as engaging as thrillers. Maybe one of the last, before we take it up for questions. Today, as you all know, is a very special day for Kolkatans, 23rd of January. We celebrate that as Netaji Dibosh, or if you will, Netaji Jayanti. But let's talk about a Divas or a Jayanti, which has been mired in controversy right from its inception. And that's Tipu Sultan Jayanti, right? So before the present government, the erstwhile government, they had institutionalized this and they were celebrating this during its term. And when the present government came on board, the Tipu Sultan Jayanti celebrations were cancelled, so that was rescinded. That was the first part, which is one thing. And then you have Yediyurappa coming up with an open press statement where he says, we are going to take Tipu Sultan off the pages of history. So how do you react to something like that?
This Tipu Jayanti thing is a drama that happens year after year. It's really a farce. To begin with, it assumes that historical figures derive their significance from whether you give them a Jayanti or not. They don't. They have their significance based on what they did in a different time. So Tipu and Tipu's heirs really, and that entire ecosystem doesn't care about whether now in 2020 a state government, you know, celebrates him or not. The other thing is, all of this is pivoted on that argument where some people say Tipu was this oppressive man who forcefully converted many Hindus, demolished temples, slaughtered cows, all of that. And others say, no, 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 he was this great administrator, a great modernizer, a man of technology, gave grants to temples. So you've got this constant tussle between which of these Tipus is real. The answer really is in the fact that it's not an either or, it's an and. Tipu was both of these things. You know, power and violence went hand in hand till about 150 years ago. Because if you had power, you had to be willing to exercise violence. And if you're doing violence, you had to show it. It had to be demonstrable violence. It had to be done in the open in order for you to retain that power. It was a union between these two concepts. So when Tipu Sultan goes out to conquer a territory, I'm a Malayali, so when he gets into Kerala to conquer, the conquest is brutal. You know, there is going to be a conversion. It's done in the name of religion and so on, because that's his justification to go in and seize territory and seize gold and treasure and property. But that does not mean that in his settled territories, he's not a good king. In his settled territories, he does give temple grants. He does maintain, Hindu religious sites. When the Marathas famously sack one of these holy spaces, it's Tipu Sultan's men who go in and sort of renovate it. So in his settled territories, he is a good king, as it were, a man who's perfectly happy to allow infidels to thrive because his power is not challenged there. But when he's conquering another territory, he's going to justify it in any method he can in order to go out there and take fire and war into that territory. Now, even that, though, has to be nuanced, because it's not like when he enters Kerala, for example, he destroys every temple that comes into his sight. It is usually temples of significance. So he says, I will tie my horse on the flagstaff of the Padmanabha Swami temple, because the Padmanabha Swami temple is integral to the legitimacy of the Travancore Maharaja. Tipu does not care about the other temples there. He cares about the main one because his idea is to delegitimize his enemy, the Travancore Maharaja. In Malabar, I recently went to this old Nambudiri Brahmin family's house. The house is in a pretty bad condition, but they have a temple. And at the temple, you've got two Dwarapalakas. And the Dwarapalakas are missing their arms. And the story goes that when Tipu Sultan passed this way, his soldiers chopped off those arms of these stone Dwarapalakas. Because this particular family was a very influential family, and they did not stay and pay homage to Tipu, they fled. So this was the way they were handled. On the other hand, the Rajas of Kolangod, also in northern Kerala, in Palakkad, in their temple, I was speaking to Jaya Jetli, who's descended from the last Raja. She was telling me that in their temple, the pedestal on which the deity is kept was donated by Tipu Sultan, because their family bent the knee, I'm assuming. I mean, that's the difference. If you stand with the invader, your temples are going to be spared. But if you're going to resist, then any temple that is significant to your ideology, to your view, and to your power will be demolished by him. It wasn't just him. When the Vijayanagar kings took war into the territories of the Bahmani sultans or the various sultanates of the Deccan, they would destroy mosques that had been built by those sultans. Not every mosque they saw. It had to be an important mosque constructed by one of these sultans to make a point. Which is not to say religion did not influence politics. It is not to say that the Indian history was a syncretic paradise where everyone was holding hands and happily running around in a garden. That's not how it was. There were bigots. There were people who milked religion for their own purposes. But we should not exaggerate that tendency. Just as today politicians do it, entirely for political reasons, very rarely out of religion, so too, back in the day, people in power used religion when it justified them. Babur, the Mughal who first came to India, at one point he needed an army from the Shah of Iran in order to get his own position secure. And at that time he happily turned into a Shia. He hated Shiism. He thought it was a heretic sect. But he happily wore the 12-pointed cap and started practicing Shiism for a brief period because he wanted to achieve something. Then he reverts to the Sunni faith, comes to India. Till then he's just another Islamic king. When does he first talk about jihad? When he's really forced into a corner. When the forces of Rana Sangha have defeated all of the men he sent after them, and they're approaching him, his astrologers told him that, you're going to lose this battle. His most famous, favorite sort of base from Afghanistan have all gone back there. So he doesn't have his best military men with him. He's really paranoid. So he smashes all the alcohol bottles and vessels and tumblers. And he says, I'm going to give up alcohol. I think it was this battle where he says, I'm going to give up alcohol and abstain for the rest of my life, a decision he regrets eventually. And he then calls it a jihad. Because at that time, that was the only way he could galvanize the forces. So everybody uses religion when it suits them. And when it does not, as I said, he was frustrated for the rest of his life because he couldn't drink. Because, that was not something he should have made. He realized, and he, of course, I think, had the astrologer thrown out for predicting a defeat. So everybody from a Babur to a Vijayanagar emperor to a Tipu Sultan picks and choose when they're going to be religious about things. That's the nature of power, and that's just how it was.
And talking about the power of astrologers, as we know, right, in the traditional Islamic canon, there's you and there's Allah, and there is the divine union or the Tawheed. There is absolutely no place for astrologers and divines and mystics of any denomination. So that it's very interesting that on the one hand, he had no love lost for the indigenous people and of their faith, and at the same time, he could be swayed quite easily by what the astrologers told him, right? Incidentally, his son Humayun, who is not really known for his great strength of character, when he was beaten soundly by Sher Shah and was an exile in Shah of Persia, he came under sort of a similar persuasion, shall we say, pressure to convert to Shiaism, and to his credit, he didn't. And he did come back with the having enlisted the support of the Shah of Persia.
It's all very selective. When I was doing my second book on the Deccan Sultans, you have this moment when Aurangzeb marches into the Golconda kingdom, determined to destroy this kingdom for once and forever. And he says, this kingdom is horrible, the ministers are Brahmins and they are infidels, and the king himself is a Shia, and therefore this by itself is justification to destroy this kingdom. Now, half of Aurangzeb's generals are Shia. So the invading army is also part Shia, half of them. And they're very annoyed with Aurangzeb for saying all this. Aurangzeb's mother comes from a Shia family.
Shaista Khan was Shia, Aurangzeb's main military strategist and later staunch ally in the Deccan, Mir Jumla,
who came from Golconda.
Yes, Golconda is Shia. Yeah. Again, because he came from Persian stock.
So you hate on Shias when you want to destroy a kingdom ruled by a Shia king. Not necessarily because, you're actually against Shiism, because your own court is heavily influenced by it. Noor Jahan, Mumtaz Mahal, they're all Shias. But anyway, so then is now politicians knew how to play their game and how to use religion whenever it was convenient for them. And we are the ones who always fall into this trap constantly again and again.
This is a fascinating conversation, and we could have gone on for hours. But, the timekeeper tells me that we are at that time when we should be taking maybe just 2 or 3 questions from the audience. I'm hoping there'll be several.
One.
We can hear you.
Yeah, thank you for an excellent conversation. Manu, my question is that as you have taken the reference that if not it is Brit, if they would not win the Battle of Palissy in 1757, who would be, whether it is French or it is Dutch or it is Maratha. So let us take in context like this, that if instead of Brit it is Maratha, and considering their characters, tyrannic, rapacious, what they have done to Bengal and Orissa, do you think that would have been a very dark era of Indian history, or very specifically in Bengal history, that instead of Brit, if Maratha prevailed in our life, Maratha of those Nagpuris of those I'm telling, can you just give an illustration on that?
Having grown up in Maharashtra, I can assure you that most Maharashtrians never learned that the Marathas are not popular in Bengal, because here they are seen as invaders.
Yes.
Here they are seen as outsiders.
Even in Orissa also.
Yeah. But you're right, which is that, it would have been, as I said earlier, another version of some very class that's coming and ruling you. So their nature is going to be, what are all these empires, whether it's the Mughals, whether it's the Sultanates of Deccan, whether it's even Vijayanagar, these are all military enterprises. Vijayanagar itself, there's this wonderful time when they conquer territories in Tamil Nadu. Now, Tamil Nadu had its own Pandyas and Cholas and Pallavas before, etc. Now, they are not going to look to these part Kannada, part Telugu kings who've come to now rule Tamil territory. So there were rebellions in Tamil Nadu, and finally Vijayanagar had to cede a lot of autonomy to those Tamil provinces. That's how they could finally manage those territories. Either the Marathas would have had to do something like that. So long as they get a share of the revenue, they let local Bengali agents or ODR agents control the territory, and that's how they maintain the peace. But this does challenge our notion that if the British hadn't come, there would have been this unitary India. No, it was far too diverse, far too split, and different groups had very different intentions. And there was no sense of, at the Sanskritic level, there was some sort of connection, which is that, Brahmins everywhere speak Sanskrit, they have the same holy books, etc. So there is a civilizational sense of continuity, but in actual military terms, not really. You're right. The Marathas would not have been received very well in Bengal or Orissa. You had a question.
Borgida deshe ashle bhalo hoto na. Lady in the front.
Good afternoon, Mr. Pillai. Thank you so much for being here with us today. My question to you is that Aisha Jalal, the Pakistani historian, Sadat Hassan Manto's grandniece, she had suggested that Jinnah was initially against the partition, and it was Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi who were like pro-partition and for their personal gains. What do you have to say for that?
I think it's too simplistic. These things evolved, frankly, in a space of about 10, 12 years, this whole partition thing. On top of that, it wasn't merely these people's decisions. It was also the World War. It was also Quit India, which threw all these Congress leaders into prison. That allowed the Muslim League to suddenly grow beyond anybody's expectations, which meant suddenly they had a far bigger share of the pie and a bigger control of the table when everybody came back for negotiations. So what in the 30s, where you could have laughed at partition, by the mid-40s, it became extremely difficult not to take it seriously because Jinnah had played and earned that position. There is a theory that he himself was just using it as a bargaining trick, as a sort of trump card really, not intending initially to take it all the way. But then, forces built up in a way. In a way, he became a victim of his own successful building up of the idea, with the result that finally there was no escaping that. But I think to say that, I haven't read the book you're referring to, but
It's an article.
okay, I haven't read it yet, so I can't comment on exactly how she makes her case. But I think it would be too simplistic in terms of our discussion to place the onus on their decisions. It wasn't really decisions they took. In many cases, their hands were moved because of other forces that they could no longer control. That's always the case, right? You create a political beast thinking that you're going to have reins on it, and you never do. Which is why that's the danger with this, with the things we're seeing in places like Uttar Pradesh, etc. You think you've got a control on these extra or non-state bands of goons who are going around beating people. Very quickly, they will seize power on their own, which is not a prediction. You read the scholar called Milan Vaishnav, who's written a book called When Crime Pays, about how crime became crime and money, corruption, became integral to the Indian electoral system. It was because from the very first elections, 1952, 51, that phase onwards, you're seeing ballot stuffing, booth capturing. There were instances even then in the very first election. And politicians locally would use lots of local strongmen. Somewhere in the middle, the strongmen realized, hey, I don't need the politician, I can become the politician. And you see a massive switch there. Something like that is probably what we're going to see as well in our own time.
We'll come to you in a minute. One has to be very cautious when addressing or dealing with specious formulations. There's another Pakistani historian called Aziz Ahmed, who comes to the conclusion that partition was not a factor of the Muslim League playing off vis-a-vis the Savarkars with Nehru and the other Congress leaders in the frame. He says that the seeds of partition was sown at the Battle of Samgar, when Dara Shikoh was defeated by Aurangzeb. That's just completely bizarre. That exonerates posthumously not just Jinnah, but every single stakeholder, all the way back to Mountbatten and the functionaries of the British Raj who took great glee and it was part of their overall plan, because they've done that in Ireland and done that in many of their other erstwhile colonies. They wanted to divide up, and we just gave them the ammo to do that. So one needs to be very cautious. Your question.
Your book is termed as Tales of History. So is it objective history, subjective narrative, satire? And how did you choose your characters in this book, 61 of them?
Yeah, to begin with, objectivity is what all historians aspire to. You're meant to be objective. That is what we try and do. But the fact of the matter is that all human beings are subjective. So the usual analogy I give is we've always got lots of filters. In a country like ours, which is so complex, to be born as a man puts a filter because you're not getting another perspective, because women have a very different experience of life. To be born as a Savarna man adds another filter. So we try objectively to peel back our filters, but whether or not you succeed, only the future can tell. You can't really decide. So no matter how objective you try to be, there's always going to be a 10% possibility of some subjective bias coming in. In terms of you mentioned the second part of the name, in terms of the topics and the subjects of the book. No, it's all fact, it's all history. It's not And there is one parody in it, which was actually a Telugu play written by a Maratha king, but that's a historical piece of literature, not my satire. No, but the title itself reflects the contents of the book. Why has it got the serpentine name of the courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahman? The courtesan represents the idea of where are the women in Indian history? Why in 2020 are all our grand narratives of Indian history populated solely by men, with the exception of a few Jhansi Ranis who've died in masculine context on the battlefield? Where are the women of ambition, of brain, of actual, who knew how to negotiate power? We don't like them because they've not conveniently gone and died on a battlefield, and they've manifested qualities that we usually prefer men to have. Now, courtesans are very interesting because courtesans, in a time when many women were illiterate, they were literate, they had physical and economic mobility, they had control over resources, which made them remarkable figures. So Begum Samru begins life in Delhi as a dancing girl, practically in a brothel. In her 20s and 30s, she becomes the companion of this German mercenary who has an army of 3,000 men. When he dies, she takes over the army, pushes out the man's legitimate son, and becomes the princess of Sardhana. Somewhere on the way, she has an affair with an Irishman, goes and marries a Frenchman. Her troops mutiny, they tie her to a gun carriage, leave her to rot in the sun for an entire week. She bounces back, reclaims the loyalty of the troops. At several moments when the Mughal emperor is besieged in his capital, it's this ex-courtesan who rushes to his rescue. And a girl who's born and raised in a brothel, who lived in a brothel, is titled Pillar of the State, Daughter of the Empire, and things like that. And she dies in 1835 as one of the most wealthy women in northern India. And she's also converted to Christianity in the process, a very weird thing to do at the time when Islam and Hinduism are your main cultural parameters. So, fascinating character. She was a contemporary of Mahatma Scindia, a rags to riches story. But because Scindia is a man, you always talk about Scindia's rags to riches. Father was a slipper carrier of the Peshwa, and previous Scindia. And Mahatma becomes this big warrior who becomes a protector of the Mughals, etc. As a man, he gets priority, but a Begum Samru is judged because she began life as a dancing girl. So that's the courtesan. The Mahatma refers not to Mahatma Gandhi, ironically, but to Mahatma Phule. Because, as I said, we often have this notion that our ancestors were all sitting with their spines erect, thinking chaste thoughts all day long. No, dissent and asking inconvenient questions, very much part of our tradition. In the 12th century, Basava says, loaded with the weight of the Vedas, the Brahmin is a veritable donkey. A very pointed attack on casteism, really, not really on Brahmins. Come down to Kabir at a certain time and he says, oh, you know, if you claim to be superior because Brahmins claimed they were superior because they were born from the head of the cosmic creator, were you delivered to the ear? Was that the birth canal? Come down to the 19th century, someone like Phule says, oh, all you Brahmins are claiming you're superior because you were born from the head of the cosmic creator. Does that mean the cosmic creator menstruates through the mouth? Very radical language, very pointed language. And this was the grandson of a grocer, grandson of a gardener. He belongs to the Mali caste, and he's got the power and personality to actually stand up and say something like this in Pune, which in Western India was the most orthodox city at the time. So that the Mahatma refers not to Gandhiji, but to dissent and Mahatma Phule. And finally, the Italian Brahmin, which just reflects human quirk. Because human beings, we often assume that kings and queens of the past occupied some other planet. The fact of the matter is they were human beings like you and me. Why is it that we keep repeating the same mistakes again and again and historical patterns repeat? Because human beings make history. Our core impulses and instincts don't change. So the Italian Brahmin refers to an actual Italian called Roberto de Nobili, who shows up in Madurai in 1606. And he's descended from Holy Roman Emperor. He's got various popes in his family, and he's come as a missionary. But having arrived here, he decides that, hold on, this isn't working. In the 15 years the mission's been there, they've had a grand success rate of 0. Like nobody's converted to Christianity. So what does he do? He Hinduizes himself. He starts wearing saffron robes. He acquires a sacred thread like a Brahmin. He says, oh, I will now only eat on a plantain leaf, not from plates. Only Brahmins can cook my food. And he's got a poor older Jesuit with him, and he tells the Jesuits, now you are lower caste, I am higher caste, so you can't eat with me anymore. When he starts traveling, you know, great kings wash his feet like any other sannyasi of the time. How many of us can really visualize in 17th century India, you know, a man who's an Italian walking around as a sannyasi in South India? It's such a bizarre picture, but it happened. So that's the third element in the book, these quirky, interesting characters. You know, the funny thing is these are documented, but because they don't fit any grand narrative, they don't fit, and they challenge many things, therefore we talk very little about them. These are people usually pushed to the footnotes of books, and I'm only trying to sort of bring them into the main narrative.
I think we have time for one last quick question. Yep, go ahead.
Sir, you said religion and politics are actually used together whenever it suits the purpose. So the objective that India and Pakistan were created on this basis, and that India was supposed to be a secular country. So, but even after being a secular country, why do we have parties using these categories still, proclaiming in the name of this fundamental, like a Hindu state, state for the Maharashtrians and all that.
You know, even at the time we officially became a secular state, the people who wrote the constitution knew very much that saying it on paper in parliament did not translate to reality on the ground. Why is, I have this, analogy. People often think that what is written in the records is gospel truth. But again, we lived in a very casteist, unequal society. Who wrote the records? The elites, the Brahmins and the upper castes, which means if you learn history only through the records, you're actually missing out on a lot of history, which is contained in song and lore and folk tradition, which is also equally legitimate history. Just because it's not written down doesn't mean it's not valuable. So tomorrow, if someone, on the basis of written documents being the main thing, 1,000 years from now, if someone uncovers from somewhere, from the earth, they dig up and they uncover a copy of our constitution, they'll think we were some wonderful society that lived, everything was equal and there was no inequality, none of that. But the fact of the matter is, what is on paper does not necessarily translate to reality. In fact, some say that this is a flaw in design. There are scholars who argue that because we officially became a secular state before society was willing to accept that sort of irreligion or lack of religiosity, there was always a certain tension between the two. Because we are a deeply religious society. Religiosity is very much part of India's DNA. So the argument was you cannot try and deny that from Delhi or from Parliament. But I suppose the state just decided to treat all religions equally rather than stay away from religion. Which is very tricky because once the state starts doing anything with religion, you can be tempted very quickly to use that. That is political. Yeah, and no, it begins even... No, it wasn't. They didn't. But as Ambedkar himself said, you've created this liberal, wonderful constitution, but it's democracy as a topsoil on a deeply illiberal, society that we have. So it was always fraught with complications. But I think there's enough cause to be optimistic. Even now, the din and the noise that is made about religion, why is there so much noise? Noise comes when you're insecure. Noise comes because you're not convinced by your own argument. That is why you make noise, to make other people think like you're in charge. So, the noise itself is a clue that it's not actually taken hold of our society like some sort of incurable cancer. The fact of the matter is, it can very easily be beaten back because it's noise, that's all.
We've overshot on our time, and on that note, we'll bring this to a close. But having said that, Manu is around. We'll saunter off to the bookstore, and we'll be there for some time. So, any of you want to take your questions or discussions offline, as we say, free to do that, right? Thanks.
Thank you, Avik, for your question.